The Cold War was a strange kind of war. It was a war without massive battles or official declarations. It was a war of ideas, of influence, and of fear. The United States and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers of the time, never directly fought each other. Yet the entire world felt the tension and lived with the consequences. This silent conflict lasted for almost half a century, from the end of World War II until the early 1990s. It was a period when the threat of nuclear annihilation loomed large. The world held its breath, wondering if and when the simmering tensions would boil over into a catastrophic conflict. The stakes were incredibly high. Both superpowers possessed nuclear weapons, weapons capable of unimaginable destruction. The fear of these weapons and the possibility of a nuclear war shaped every aspect of the Cold War. It was a time of espionage, of propaganda, and of proxy wars fought in far-flung corners of the globe. It was a time when the world was divided into two armed camps, each suspicious and distrustful of the other. The Cold War was more than just a rivalry between two superpowers. It was a global ideological struggle that divided the world into two opposing blocs. On one side stood the United States, championing democracy, capitalism, and individual liberty. On the other side stood the Soviet Union, promoting communism, a centrally planned economy, and the idea of a classless society. This ideological divide cut deep, shaping international relations, influencing domestic politics, and even impacting culture and art. Countries around the world were forced to choose sides, aligning themselves either with the West or the East. This division was not always clear-cut. Many countries, particularly in the developing world, chose to remain non-aligned, seeking to chart their own course in a world increasingly polarized by the Cold War. Nevertheless, the shadow of the superpower rivalry loomed large over every corner of the globe. The Cold War was a time of great anxiety and uncertainty. The constant threat of nuclear war created a climate of fear and suspicion. People lived with the knowledge that the world could be destroyed in an instant. The seeds of the Cold War were sown in the closing days of World War II. The United States and the Soviet Union, once allies against Nazi Germany, found themselves increasingly at odds. The wartime alliance, forged in the crucible of conflict, quickly crumbled in the face of deep-seated ideological differences and mutual suspicion. The United States, deeply suspicious of Soviet intentions, sought to contain the spread of communism. The Soviet Union, for its part, was determined to expand its influence in Eastern Europe, creating a buffer zone against what it perceived as Western hostility. These competing visions for the post-war world set the stage for a long and dangerous standoff. The Cold War was not a war in the traditional sense, but a struggle for global dominance, waged through propaganda, espionage, economic pressure, and proxy wars. The Cold War was a global chess match, with each superpower making strategic moves and countermoves in an attempt to outmaneuver the other. It was a high-stakes game, with the fate of the world hanging in the balance. One of the most iconic symbols of the Cold War was the Berlin Wall. Erected in 1961, the wall physically and ideologically divided the city of Berlin, and indeed, the whole of Germany. It stood as a stark reminder of the Iron Curtain that had descended across Europe, separating East from West. The construction of the wall was a direct response to the mass exodus of East Germans fleeing to the West. Desperate to stem the flow of refugees, the East German government, with Soviet backing, erected the wall practically overnight. The Berlin Wall became a potent symbol of communist oppression and the division of Europe. For nearly 3 decades, it served as a physical manifestation of the Cold War, a concrete barrier separating families, friends, and a nation. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, met with jubilation around the world, was a pivotal moment in the latter part of the Cold War. It signaled the beginning of the end for the Soviet bloc and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union itself. A Caribbean crisis for the world. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. When the United States discovered Soviet missiles being deployed in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, the world held its breath. For 13 tense days, the two superpowers stood eyeball to eyeball. each possessing the firepower to destroy the other many times over. The world watched in horror, fearing that a miscalculation or a moment of panic could trigger an apocalyptic conflict. Through a combination of diplomacy, brinkmanship, and perhaps a bit of luck, the crisis was averted. The Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba, and the United States, in a secret agreement, pledged to remove its missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a sobering reminder of the fragility of peace in the nuclear age. It underscored the need for clear communication, restraint, and a willingness to compromise in order to avoid catastrophic conflict. The Vietnam quagmire. The Vietnam War was another tragic chapter in the Cold War. It was a proxy war, a conflict in which the United States and the Soviet Union supported opposing sides, but did not directly engage each other militarily. The United States, determined to contain the spread of communism, intervened in Vietnam, supporting the South Vietnamese government against the Communist North. The Soviet Union and China, in turn, provided material and logistical support to the North Vietnamese. The Vietnam War was a long and costly conflict, claiming the lives of millions of Vietnamese and over 58,000 American soldiers. It became increasingly unpopular in the United States, sparking widespread protests and dividing public opinion. The war ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon to North Vietnamese forces. The Vietnam War was a major setback for the United States and a significant victory for the Communist bloc. A world on edge. The Cold War was a period of constant tension and uncertainty. The two superpowers engaged in a relentless arms race, each seeking to outdo the other in terms of military might. The world watched nervously as the nuclear arsenals of both sides grew larger and more sophisticated. The Cold War also spawned a global network of espionage and covert operations. Both sides invested heavily in intelligence gathering, seeking to uncover each other's secrets and undermine their opponent's influence. The Cold War had a profound impact on popular culture. The fear of nuclear war permeated everything from music and literature to film and television. The Cold War became a defining feature of the era, shaping the way people lived, thought, and dreamed. The thaw. By the 1980s, the Cold War began to wind down. The Soviet Union, weakened by economic stagnation and internal dissent, was no longer able to sustain its global ambitions. The arrival of Mikhail Gorbachev as the leader of the Soviet Union in 1985 ushered in a period of reform and openness known as perestroika and glasnost. Gorbachev sought to reform the Soviet system, but ultimately hastened its demise. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was a watershed moment, signaling the end of the Cold War. With astonishing speed, communist regimes across Eastern Europe collapsed, and the Soviet Union itself dissolved in 1991. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but a whimper. The ideological struggle that had defined a generation simply faded away, leaving behind a world grappling with the legacy of a conflict that had shaped its destiny. A lasting legacy. The Cold War may be over, but its legacy continues to shape the world we live in today. The geopolitical landscape we see today, with the United States as the sole remaining superpower, is a direct result of the outcomes of the Cold War. The Cold War also left behind a vast arsenal of nuclear weapons, a sobering reminder of the destructive power at humanity's disposal. The threat of nuclear proliferation remains a major concern in the 21st century. The Cold War taught us valuable lessons about the importance of diplomacy, the dangers of ideological extremism, and the need for international cooperation. As we navigate the complexities of the 21st century, we would do well to remember the lessons of the Cold War and work towards building a more peaceful and just world.